So, Dr. Labos, because we don't have enough to worry about, I sent you this article and I said you need to talk about this because I've heard other people bring this up, and it concerns plastic. And one thing I've never seen it linked to before I saw this article to heart damage or heart attacks. So, tell us, because this is a fairly recent study, right? It's from only a couple of years ago.
Yes. Now, people have looked at this before, and they have done studies where they found traces of microplastics in various types of bodily tissues. And what they have done is they've done studies where they take the plaque that builds up in your arteries and they find traces of microplastics in it. Okay? Now, this study was, as you said, a little bit different, and this is a new study. What they did here was they were taking patients that were coming to the hospital for an angiogram. Okay? So they were coming to get an artery unblocked. And what they did was, as they were getting their angiograms, they took blood samples to measure the concentrations of microplastics and nanoplastics. And I will explain the difference between those two things in a second. And basically what they did was they took patients and divided them into different categories. You had patients that were coming in with heart attacks. You had patients that were coming in with sort of chronic coronary disease that they've had for years. And you had patients who ultimately were found to be normal. So you had about 20 patients in each group, and what they found was that there was a big difference in how frequently they were able to find microplastics and nanoplastics in the blood samples of these patients. So if you were coming in with a heart attack, about 80% of those patients had a significant amount of microplastics, nanoplastics in their blood. If you just had regular heart disease, you found the plastics about 40% of the time. And if you were normal, you had plastics in your blood of 32% of the time. So this was a statistically significant difference, and it led them to hypothesize that microplastics, nanoplastics might actually be contributing to cardiovascular disease in some way. Now, as you might be able to guess from my tone, there are some caveats here, and of course, that's what I do because I have to ruin everything. Even though 80% of heart attack patients had microplastics, 20% didn't, and even 32% of people with normal coronary arteries had microplastics in their blood. So this was not a perfect correlation. There were quite a few people who were discordant with the hypothesis. Okay. But that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. The other thing you have to keep in mind is, remember, heart disease is something that develops very, very slowly over time. Even somebody who's having a heart attack, that plaque, yes, the heart attack is sudden, but the plaque has been building up over a considerable amount of time. And of course, it's all the risk factors over the past 10 to 20 years that contribute to your risk of heart disease. If you're drawing plastics now, once somebody's presented to the hospital, you don't know if they had traces of microplastics in their blood 20 years ago when this process started. And so the temporality has been lost when you're doing this type of study, which is a cross-sectional study where you're only looking at people at one point in time. What you ideally want to do, especially with chronic diseases, is you want to measure people before they get sick and then wait to see if the people with high amounts of microplastics in their blood get sick over time, which is more complicated, but it would be the preferable type of way to do the study. And then the final sort of caveat to all of this, before we really start picking this apart, is that there was one variable that was an independent predictor of whether you had microplastics in your blood, and that was if you were a smoker.
I knew it. Okay.
Yeah. So if you were a smoker, you had higher degrees of microplastics in your blood. Now, why is that the case? Was it the cigarette itself, or are you just unhealthy overall? But now you have to ask the question, okay, so people with microplastics are having heart attacks, but people with microplastics are also smokers. So is it the smoking or is it the microplastics, or are these two things so invariably linked that it's hard to tease out which is the problem? And so the whole issue with microplastics, we can get into, the WHO had a consensus paper on this a couple of years ago where they outlined a lot of the problems. In no way assume that I am saying that microplastics are good for you. But we have a real problem, is that we know microplastics are in the environment, which is probably not a good thing. We know that microplastics are getting into our bodies, which is probably not a good thing. But it's actually very hard to prove that microplastics are actually causing disease, whether it's cancer or heart disease or whatever, because there's so many variables that might be a problem. And you might say to yourself, well, who cares? These sound terrible. Let's get rid of them anyway. And there is some validity to that. But it is going to be hard to upend our entire manufacturing process. And there are people who will make the argument agree with it or not, that maybe we shouldn't really disrupt our whole way of manufacturing things until we're certain that these things are actually dangerous. Because if it turns out they're not, then we may end up spending a lot of money for no clear benefit when we probably should have been trying to get people to smoke less.
So if I can leave the smoking aside for a second, you're right, it's an interesting part of the study. The idea of microplastics, and, I know people have brought this up. If you go down that, rabbit hole, you'll see all kinds of stuff where people saying it's the worst thing ever. But, with respect to degrading of plastic, right? This idea of would you put it in a microwave, or that's really where the problem begins. Is there validity to that?
Well, there is some validity to the fact that as the plastic products degrade, that's going to be an issue. So if you go and you get, a plastic bottle of water, which you probably shouldn't do because it's not great for the environment. But if it's a new bottle of plastic and you drink from it, there's probably not that much microplastics in there. Whereas if it's a bottle that you keep reusing, with each reuse, with each washing, eventually those plastics are going to start to get away. So there is something to that. The more, I think, problematic issue with microplastics is that we don't actually have a standardized way of measuring them. And so every research team is sort of measuring them differently, and we're kind of treating them as if there's one thing, and we tend to sort of put them all into the same basket, and we talk about micro/nanoplastics. But if you think about it, official definition, a microplastic is something that's less than 5 millimeters, a nanoplastic is something that's less than 0.001 millimeters, so microscopic. So if we're assuming those two things are kind of the same, but they're probably not. If you're worried about tiny plastic particles getting into your system, it's much more likely that the smaller invisible particles are going to be more dangerous than the larger macroscopically visible ones. And yet the research often treats them the same. Whereas we don't actually have a very, very good analytical techniques for measuring the small ones, nor do we actually differentiate them based on type and shape, which would be another issue. So the issue with microplastics from a research perspective is that we have no standardized techniques for measuring and assessing them, which is why the research is a little bit mushy on this topic. Now, again, you can make the argument, look, this is probably a bad idea. Let's get moving since it's going to take so long to actually phase them out of our manufacturing. It really becomes a question of, do you want to act now with incomplete evidence, or are you willing to wait potentially many, many years until the evidence becomes definitive? And everybody's going to come down differently on that side of the debate.
Where do you come down on this?
I'm on the fence, as it is with most things. I am becoming increasingly concerned with microplastics. I, at the same time, can recognize that the research is not definitive, while also simultaneously saying this is probably not a good thing. Just from the environmental perspective, it probably is going to be a good idea for us to start switching away from plastics and maybe going back to things like, glass and stuff that was maybe more fragile, but maybe a little bit better for the environment and for our health. So I am concerned, and yet I do wish that we would just, invest the money. It's going to be very, very difficult to do, but at a certain point, somebody's going to have to do the large, definitive, very, very expensive study to measure this stuff in a standardized way and look to see what the long-term implications are, because all of these studies now are really suggestive, but we're not getting to the final point. Somebody's going to have to do the big definitive study, but that's going to take a lot of money, and the problem with research money is that it's always in short supply.
Take a lot of time, too, despite all the sort of ancillary studies that are already there. Chris, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hello, Canada.
This is Bryan Adams Radio, hosted by Bryan Adams himself.
We'll play a few of mine, a ton of my favorites, and some must-hear behind-the-scenes stories from the world of rock and roll. I'm coming to get you! One thing about doing rock and roll so long is you end up meeting a lot of the people that you admire. Sometimes you even get to work with them. It's only love, and that's all.
Bryan Adams Radio.
I'm coming back to you.
Now available on the free iHeartRadio app.
Hey everybody, how are you tonight? Sounds great.